Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're diving into a topic that's been making headlines for decades, the state of Palestine.
Hmm.
You've given us some really interesting excerpts from the Wikipedia article. So our mission is to really go beyond the headlines and get a deeper understanding of this partially recognized state. You ready to go beyond just knowing the basics?
Absolutely. And you've hit on something important right away, even with the term Palestine. It's used in so many different ways with different meanings. Are we talking about the actual land, the state declared in '88, the Palestinian Authority, the PLO?
Yeah, it's like trying to solve a puzzle, but the pieces keep changing shape. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. You're interested in the state of Palestine, and it's impossible to talk about it without understanding its history. It's a land that's important to so many different religions, but also one that's been marked by conflict.
And this is where things get really interesting. This is not just some regional thing. This conflict has major implications globally for politics, for international relations.
Exactly. Get ready, because we're about to take a trip through time and politics. We'll uncover how this unique and, let's face it, difficult situation came to be. And believe me, we'll be uncovering some surprising things as we go.
One of the most striking things you realize when you really dive into this is that more than half of the Palestinian population doesn't even live within the state of Palestine. They're spread all over the world, a diaspora created from conflict and displacement.
Wow, that's a massive amount of people. It really highlights the impact of that 1948 war and the displacement of Palestinian Arabs. That event's known as the Nakba, which, if you didn't know, translates to catastrophe in Arabic.
And to make it even more complex, the state of Palestine is recognized by many UN members, but not by all, including, importantly, the United States.
And get this, the capital they declared back in '88, Jerusalem, is under Israeli control. It really makes you wonder, how can a state even work when it doesn't have control over its own capital?
That's a question that goes right to the core of this conflict and why finding a lasting peace has been so difficult. How can you have a government that works properly, set up embassies, or even just hold symbolic events when you don't have access to your capital?
This feels like just the beginning. To really get a handle on the situation in the state of Palestine today, we need to go back in time. Understand the history, the impact of different empires, and the cultures that have mixed over the centuries. Think of it like a crash course, but a million times more interesting than any history class.
Oh, it's a fascinating history for sure, one that goes way beyond just 1948. We're talking about a region that's been a crossroads for civilizations for centuries. Canaanites, Philistines, Israelites, Romans, Ottomans, they've all left their mark on this land.
It's like a who's who of ancient history, all in one place.
And to add to that, Palestine's historical importance isn't just tied to one religion, it's considered part of the Holy Land by a lot of different faiths. This makes the culture so rich, but it's also a source of both unity and tension.
Sounds like a real pressure cooker of history.
Exactly. And you need to understand that historical context to unpack what's happening in the state of Palestine right now. It's like trying to solve a complicated math problem without knowing the basic formulas.
So let's get into it. What are some of the key moments that have shaped the state of Palestine into what we see today?
Well, to really understand it all, we need to go back to a really important time, the time of the British Mandate after World War I. That's where a lot of the groundwork for the situation today was laid down.
Things are about to get interesting.
So after World War I, the League of Nations basically gave Great Britain control over Palestine, calling it the British Mandate for Palestine. And, well, they walked right into this situation where they were trying to keep everyone happy, both the Palestinians and the Zionists who wanted to create a Jewish homeland there.
Yeah, classic case of promising too much to too many people. Sounds like a recipe for trouble.
Yeah, you could say that. And as you can imagine, things started to get tense, especially with more and more Jewish people immigrating, which, by the way, was encouraged by the British. This obviously led to friction with the Arab population who were already living there.
So the stage is set for conflict. Is this what led up to the 1948 war?
Exactly. By 1947, things were getting really bad, very unstable. The British realized they were in over their heads and decided to hand the problem over to the United Nations, which was brand new at the time.
Passing the buck, a classic move.
Yeah.
So what did the UN come up with?
Well, they came up with this plan to partition the land, divide it up into two independent states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem as kind of a separate international zone. On paper, it probably looked like a good solution, but
There's always a but, right?
always. The Palestinian Arabs, well, they just flat out rejected the plan, and that was a major reason for the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, which was devastating for the Palestinians.
Right. That's when we see the mass displacement of Palestinians, the Nakba that we talked about before.
Yes. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were forced from their homes, becoming refugees. It was a traumatic experience that still shapes Palestinian identity today. And it gets worse. After the war, Israel controlled even more land than the partition plan had given them. Meanwhile, Egypt occupied the Gaza Strip and Jordan decided to annex the West Bank.
So not only were they displaced, but the land they'd hoped for was also divided up and occupied by others. What happened to the idea of a Palestinian state during this time?
It's a good question, and it gets even more complicated. The All-Palestine government, which was initially supported by Egypt, well, it just dissolved. The international community said no to Jordan's annexation of the West Bank, but it stayed under Jordanian control. In the middle of all this chaos, a new player emerged. The Palestine Liberation Organization, better known as the PLO.
The PLO. That's a name that carries weight. Tell me more about them.
The PLO was formed in 1964, first in Jordan, then they moved to Lebanon. Their goal was pretty straightforward: liberate Palestine from Israeli rule. But it's important to understand that when the PLO says Palestine, they don't just mean the West Bank and Gaza. They mean all the land they believe is historically theirs, including what is now Israel.
So they were initially fighting for a single state, not a two-state solution.
At the beginning, yes, that was their stance. Their position would change over time, but that was how they started. The PLO's influence grew a lot in the 1970s. The Arab League recognized them as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. They even got observer status at the UN.
So they were gaining recognition around the world, even without a physically recognized state.
Exactly. And this brings us to another pivotal point. The First Intifada, the Palestinian uprising against the Israeli occupation that began in 1987.
So now we're moving from the history books into, well, more recent events. This is where things start to heat up. But before we dive into the First Intifada and the declaration of an independent state of Palestine, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back to unpack how Palestinian governance has unfolded amidst all of this. All right, we're back. Right before the break, we were talking about the First Intifada. That feels like a really important moment in this story.
Oh, it was a powerful, sustained uprising. It really got the world's attention. I think that was the first time that a lot of people outside the region really saw what daily life was like under occupation. It changed the political landscape, in a way that other events hadn't.
And it was right in the middle of this, in 1988, that the PLO made a really big move, declaring the establishment of the State of Palestine.
Yeah, it was a hugely symbolic declaration, I mean, they weren't actually in control of all the territory they were claiming, so it was more like a statement of their goals, their aspirations, rather than anything else. But it definitely resonated. A lot of countries, especially important Arab states like Egypt and Jordan, officially recognized them.
And it changed how things worked at the UN, right?
Totally. They didn't get full UN membership, but the General Assembly started using the name Palestine officially instead of Palestine Liberation Organization. Might seem like a small thing, but symbolically, it was big.
So the State of Palestine existed, on paper at least, but what about in reality? What happened next?
Well, the First Intifada went on for a few more years, until '93, and then there was the Oslo Accords. Back then there was a lot of hope, this sense that maybe, just maybe, this could lead to a two-state solution.
Oslo. Weren't those the famous handshakes on the White House lawn?
Those are the ones.
Yeah.
Yasser Arafat, he was the chairman of the PLO, and Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli prime minister at the time, shook hands with President Bill Clinton standing right there. It was a big deal, for sure. Israel officially recognized the PLO, and the Palestinian Authority, or PA, was created. It was supposed to be like an interim governing body, for parts of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip.
So not a full-fledged state yet, but like a step closer?
That was the idea anyway. They called it a phased approach, with the goal of coming to a final agreement within 5 years. The PA was given some control, some self-governance in certain areas. They called them Areas A and B. But Israel kept control of Area C, which is, well, most of the West Bank.
And what about Jerusalem? Still a big issue, I'd imagine.
Of course, of course. Jerusalem was put on hold. They decided to deal with it later in the negotiations, but, well, that became one of the sticking points that really messed up the whole Oslo process.
So Oslo started out hopeful, but kind of fell apart. What happened?
You said it. I mean, there were some good things that came out of it. For example, the first Palestinian general elections ever were held in 1996, which was huge. But there were so many setbacks with Oslo, violence, and this feeling of, I don't know, like disappointment on both sides. And then Prime Minister Rabin was assassinated in 95 by a Jewish extremist, which was a devastating blow to the whole peace process.
Too tragic.
And then in 2000, the second intifada began, which was even more violent and destructive than the first.
It was a very dark time. Suicide bombings, targeted killings. Israel built that separation barrier in the West Bank, which just further divided the Palestinian territories. Things were awful in Gaza, too. Israel imposed that blockade after Hamas, that's the Islamist militant group, won the Palestinian elections in 2006 and then took over Gaza in 2007. Wow, so not only were they facing pressure from outside, but there were internal divisions, too, that were making this Palestinian dream of having their own state even harder.
That's the sad truth. The West Bank and Gaza basically became separate entities. The PA, led by Fatah, governed the West Bank, and Hamas ruled Gaza. They've tried to reconcile, but so far a lasting unity government just hasn't happened.
So where does this leave the state of Palestine today? What does this future hold?
It's complicated. The challenges are huge. The ongoing occupation, the division in the government, security concerns, and a struggling economy. But the Palestinian people are resilient. They're deeply committed to education. They have a very vibrant culture. And there's a new generation rising that's determined to create a better future for themselves.
And there have been some things happening at the UN that seem promising, right?
Yeah. In 2024, a UN General Assembly resolution gave Palestine more rights. They can actually submit proposals and amendments now, and even sit with the member states in the assembly. Plus, the resolution reaffirmed their right to full UN membership.
So some positive steps, but still a long way to go.
Exactly. The big question is, will the world, especially the United States, finally step up and put pressure on Israel to end the occupation and allow for a truly independent Palestinian state? It's a situation that's constantly changing. We need to stay informed and engaged.
It's a story that's still being written, that's for sure. Hopefully this deep dive has given you a better understanding of how complex the situation in the state of Palestine really is, the historical context, the political roadblocks, and the human stories at its core. It's an issue that deserves our attention.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And remember, understanding the past is so important if you want to understand the present and maybe even help shape the future. Keep asking those tough questions and stay curious, everyone.